Hello and welcome to Crash Course History. Today we'll be asking the question, can walls stop the destruction and violence stemming from ideological differences? Ideological differences being the them and us concept in different contexts. To examine this thoroughly, we'll be looking all throughout history, beginning with the infamous walls of Constantinople. The city known as present-day Istanbul, Turkey, was once the center of the Byzantine Empire. In 658 BCE, Greek colonists followed their leader Byzas and founded the city of Byzantium, the capital of the eastern section of the Roman Empire. The first wall around the ever-growing city was made in roughly 480 BCE. The city prospered and remained uneventful, but hundreds of years later is when their history starts to get interesting. In 193 AD, Byzantium supported the enemy of Roman politician and soon-to-be emperor, Septimius Severus, and he unleashed his forces on them. The city held out against him, hiding behind their walls for 3 years, until their resources ran out in 196 AD. Severus's punishment was harsh. He demolished their walls, costing them their civic status, and thus demoting them to a lowly village. Not long after, Severus realized how strategically convenient the location of the village was for him, and as an apology, he rebuilt their walls slightly larger, even going so far as to endow them with monuments, a hippodrome, and luxurious baths. The new walls survived and protected its people through many sieges and conflicts, until the city itself outgrew Severus's walls in 324. The pattern of Severus, of defeating and then revitalizing, repeated itself with a new Roman emperor named Constantine. He also punished Byzantium for siding with his enemy. However, he realized quite quickly the city's geographical advantages. He rebuilt the city even bigger than before, including a brand new wall finished in 336 AD. It was renamed New Rome, or Second Rome, though it was commonly referred to as Constantinople after its recent savior. By the 5th century, the walls were outgrown again and replaced by a new outer wall as primary defense. During this time, Theodosius II reigned as emperor from 402 to 450 AD. He built a new wall for defensive purposes, called the Theodosian Wall. Constantine's wall remained, and was now referred to as the Inner Wall. The Theodosian Wall was progressively destroyed by earthquakes in 437, 447, and 448 AD, and then rebuilt in an impressive 60 days with an added outer wall and moat enhancing the defenses of the city against outsiders. The rebuilding was incredibly fast because of the incoming threat that was Attila the Hun in the Balkans. The outer and inner wall were usually both staffed during a conflict. When numbers were running thin, such as when the Black Plague had run rampant throughout Europe resulting in few men left to fight during the war with the Ottoman Empire, only the Theodosian Wall could be manned. In 1453, the Muslim Ottomans were aggressively expanding their empire. They saw the potential in Constantinople for trade and influence, thus making it a prime target for expansion. Despite the Romans thinking that a wall would keep them safe from others, in this case the Ottomans, it failed, and the Muslims successfully conquered the Christian city of Constantinople. The repercussions of the fall of Constantinople are felt today. With unobstructed access to the Mediterranean Sea, the spread of Islam accelerated, beginning in North Africa and spreading throughout the continent. As well, it triggered the age of exploration. When the Ottomans cut off access to the Silk Road to have more control of the trade market, Europeans were forced to find another route to continue trading with Asia. While they were exploring for new routes, the Americas were accidentally discovered by Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator. Explorers called it the New World, soon to be called America. With the fall of Constantinople to the Muslim Ottomans, the remaining Greek Christians fled to Italy. They brought with them their rich culture and knowledge, contributing to the flourishing Renaissance. A consequence of the Renaissance can be seen with the building of peace walls in Ireland, starting in the 1960s to separate Catholics and Protestants from each other. A centuries-long conflict is still being fought in Ireland, specifically in Northern Ireland. It began around the 17th century with the Protestant Reformation. The rise of Protestantism around Europe quickly spread to England and Scotland. Protestants saw their religion as superior to Ireland's Catholicism, so the English and Scots set off to claim the land as their own and make sure their religion was majority. The result of this ideological conflict was 2 gruesome religious wars, the Confederate Wars and the Williamite War. The Protestants won both. However, going into the 19th century, the conflict stopped being so much about religion and more about politics. The settlers, nicknamed the Loyalists, were very loyal to their homeland and wished to remain so. However, the Irish were nationalists. They wanted to live how they used to, on lands separate from Great Britain. Loyalists won over the government, and thus the Acts of the Union 1800 came into effect, creating the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. As expected, the nationalists were angry, so the Home Rule movement began shortly thereafter, in the 1870s. Their goal was to allow Ireland to self-govern within the United Kingdom. In the late 19th to early 20th century, Unionists, the Loyalists, and Home Rulers were the main political factions of Ireland. 40 years later, as the Home Rule Bill was about to be passed in British Parliament, the Ulster Covenant was issued in response by the Loyalists. It was named after the area of Ireland first colonised by the Protestants. As well, they formed the paramilitary Ulster Volunteer Force, UVF. In rebuttal, the Irish Volunteers was created. Before a civil war could break out, the First World War began, and civic matters were placed on the shelf. However, immediately after World War I ended, the Irish War for Independence began, lasting 3 years and ultimately resulting in the Irish Free State. This is when the Government of Ireland Act 1920 came into play, separating the counties into Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. The Loyalists in Northern Ireland were severely against the Irish Free State and opted out in December 1922. 557 people, most of whom were nationalists, were killed in those counties, both during and after the Irish Civil War. In 1922, the Government of Northern Ireland enacted the Special Powers Act, giving immense power to the government and especially police, allowing them to intern suspects without trial and administer corporal punishment, to re-establish or preserve law and order. The act continued to be used against nationalists long after the violence of the period stopped. Political boundaries were redrawn in favour of loyalists, and more sectarian unrest followed, including severe rioting in Belfast in the 30s and 50s, though it's in the late 60s where the violence truly ramped up. This period is referred to as the Troubles, lasting 30 years. In 1969, nationalist civil rights activists and associations went on peaceful protests, only to get attacked and beaten by loyalist citizens and police. Many more fights occurred involving brick throwing, petrol bombs, and water cannons, with the British Army also using tear gas and machine guns. Refugee camps were set up along county borders for the nearly 2,000 families who were forced to flee their homes due to the violence. On the 10th of September the same year, the first peace wall was built. It still stands today. The number of peace walls standing has increased to 60 in 2017. They are placed in interface areas, neighbourhoods where nationalist and loyalist residential areas meet. They can be up to 8 meters high, built of iron, brick, steel, or a combination, and range from a few hundred meters long to over 5 kilometers. Some have gates that are patrolled by police and closed at night. Their purpose, like the walls of Constantinople, is to stop the violence stemming from their ideological conflict. However, hundreds of people have been killed within 50 meters of the peace walls. They may have decreased the violence, but they certainly haven't stopped it. It sounds like it's time for B's interesting fact of the day. Most people think Wall Street is named after a fictional wall, but believe it or not, the wall was real. However, its history is quite dark. Back in 1653, enslaved Africans brought over to New England by the Dutch built the barrier. Its purpose was to defend the colonizers against a land invasion from their enemy, the English, who were occupying neighboring colonies in New England at the time. The wall stayed in use because of the Dutch's fear of attacks from outsiders, indigenous peoples, the English, and pirates. When the English managed to take over the Dutch colony in 1664, they too improved the wall, as did the Dutch again during their brief retaking of the city in 1674. By the late 1600s, the wall encircled most of the city with 2 large bastions on either side. The road where it was located was accurately called Wall Street by the Dutch, and because of its clarity, it's what we still call it today. However, as the city was invaded 3 times, the wall clearly didn't help protect or defend, so it was taken down in 1699. A new city hall was built in 1700 using the stones from the bastions for the foundation. While the Dutch knew they held a strong view of the English as others, one subconscious xenophobic view they had was with enslaved people. Slavery was introduced to Manhattan in 1626. To make their masters extra profit from slave rentals, the enslaved people had to walk around the streets to sell themselves, says Christopher Paul Moore, a senior researcher at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. However, this practice didn't last long, as white colonials feared the African laborers talking to each other in the street would lead to a slave rebellion. To solve this issue, a slave market was made at the end of Wall Street in 1711 by the New York City Common Council. It was a wooden structure that could hold about 50 men. There, enslaved people were bought, sold, and traded amongst the whites. For the enslaved people that were not sold and taken elsewhere, they did the heavy work for constructing Lower Manhattan, such as clearing land, building the port, and creating roads. Not only did the city benefit from the free infrastructure, their taxes implemented on every human being traded from the market, but also from the enslaved produced commodities in the South, such as sugar and cotton. New York was a major stop on the transport of those goods, says Alan J. Singer, a professor of social studies at Hofstra University, New York, and as a result, the city got 40% of the entire US cotton revenue. One of America's biggest sugar factories, Domino Sugar, relied on the refined sugarcane and molasses made by enslaved Africans in the Caribbean. Several of America's largest banks, such as J.P. Morgan Chase, have clear ties to slavery, including accepting enslaved people as collateral for loans. Slavery was outlawed in the northern states of America in 1776. However, men found a way around this and continued to make profit from enslavement. To do so, in 1792, 24 men signed the Buttonwood Agreement. It established better trade negotiations, allowing a 25% cut of the sold goods, but only for those who signed the agreement. This removed auctioneers from the process, people these men particularly disliked as they would often manipulate prices. This contract incited stricter rules on trading securities, allowing for a larger market to grow. The Buttonwood Agreement is the backbone of the New York Stock Exchange, the true reason Wall Street is famous today. Wall Street became the center of business on the back of the slave trade and slavery itself. Slavery established Wall Street as the financial capital of the world, a designation the city still reaps benefits from to this day through tourism and the stock exchange. As well, after the Civil War, a series of laws that economically and politically disenfranchised formerly enslaved people led to many of today's inequalities in America. It took until 2015 for the city to create a sign in a park on Wall Street as a permanent reminder of their foundations. The story of Wall Street shows that walls not only are unhelpful with stopping conflicts with outsiders, as we saw from the Anglo-Dutch Wars, but also with ideological conflicts inside the walls. Walls even hinder the inner city, as they restrict communication with outer communities. Those on the inside are unable to share ideas and realize their wrongdoings, and are stuck in their horrific cycles. Today we have found that walls are not only unable to prevent destruction from ideological differences, but also exaggerate the conflicts born within the walls. From medieval times to the Renaissance, to the slave trade, to North and South Korea, to Trump, we still haven't learned our lesson. Walls just aren't worth it.